to really escalate the noise we make so that we'll be heard. Welcome to Gay USA. I'm Andy Humm.
I'm Ann Northrup.
And our guest for the next hour in this special edition of Gay USA is Peter Tatchell, gay and human rights activist from the United Kingdom, originally born in Australia, basically Britain's leading gay rights activist, and certainly very involved with the human rights movement, co-founder of Outrage in 1990, his group, stood as a candidate for Parliament, was involved in the early Gay Liberation Front, came out in 1969. You may know him as the man who made a citizen's arrest of Robert Mugabe in London back in 1999.
Can't wait to hear about that.
Stopped Tony Blair's car personally to protest the Iraq War, and mounted the pulpit in Canterbury Cathedral to speak out against anti-gay bigotry on Easter Sunday. Just to, in case people need a little jogging of some of the things you've been involved with, we have this 2007 tape at the attempted Moscow Pride March where you were involved.
You were violently
Peter Tatchell had just finished giving interviews. His attacker appeared from behind the line of journalists, seemingly unconcerned by the dozens of cameras and potential witnesses. He was then dragged away by the police. The singer, Richard Fairbrass, from the band Right Said Fred, was also assaulted. He was among a group attempting to deliver a letter, also signed by members of the European Parliament, requesting permission to hold a march in central Moscow. Its powerful mayor has so far refused, referring to such events as the work of Satan. These ultra-right extremists are chanting glory to Russia. They're opposed to any open celebration of homosexuality. The march was to mark the 14th anniversary of its decriminalisation. Although a number of gay clubs have opened, public intolerance remains high. This hostility has united communists and hardline Orthodox Christians who see the gay marchers as troublemakers and subversives. Many gay activists were expecting trouble following the violence that ended last year's banned march.
Same shirt, Peter?
Not quite. Blue this time and purple.
Yeah, well, look, our viewers do know you from many, many clips we've run like that of your activism around the world. I want to get into all of that, into individual things you've done, but let me start by asking you about how you became an activist in the first place, because I don't know, are we born activists, or were you recruited into it?
Well, I came from a very small C conservative working class family in Melbourne, Australia. None of my family were political at all. I had no real political influences around me, but just as a teenager I sort of worked things out for myself. I saw the nightly news with the black civil rights movement here in the United States and was inspired by that. I saw the nightly news bulletins of the war in Vietnam, which Australia was also involved with alongside the United States.
Yes.
And it pricked my conscience and made me feel that these were injustices that had to be challenged. And of course, a bit later when I realized I was gay, I felt, well, maybe we could use the tactics of the black civil rights movement, or before them the suffragettes, to advance the cause of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender freedom.
So you were involved in demonstrations against the Vietnam War?
Absolutely, yes.
Was that the beginning of your actually getting out in the street and doing things?
The first protest I ever was involved in was against the death penalty in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia. A convict was due to be due to be hanged for allegedly shooting dead a prison warder. But I worked out at the age of 15 the trajectory of the bullet through the warder's body meant that almost certainly he could not have fired the fatal bullet.
Wow.
He was hanged anyway, and that pushed me to a life of skepticism towards the government, the police, the judiciary, because they had this evidence as well, and indeed 3 decades later there was an inquiry which came to exactly the same conclusion that I came to as a 15-year-old. So an innocent man was hanged, and that did make me very skeptical of authority, whereas previously I'd just taken things for granted that the government was on our side and served the people.
And what was the first foray into LGBT activism?
Well, I came out in 1969, age 17.
Still in Melbourne.
Still in Melbourne. And sort of in the latter part of that year, I read about a gay rights protest here in New York. It was a very, very small news in brief item. It just said something like thousands of homosexuals marched last night through New York to demand equal rights. And I thought to myself, wow, this is what we need here.
That must have been Stonewall in 1969.
No, it wasn't Stonewall. It was one of the demonstrations after Stonewall.
Okay.
But of course, in Melbourne in those days, there were no gay rights organisations at all, not even any helplines or support or counselling services. There was absolutely nothing, just a couple of seedy bars, and that was it. So I remember talking to some of my friends and saying, we need to take inspiration from these people in New York, and we need to organise, because in those days, homosexuality was still totally illegal, and you could be jailed for several years, and even subjected to compulsory psychiatric treatment. All my friends said, you're crazy, you're mad. You're only 17, what do you know? You'll get us all arrested, go away. So I couldn't persuade anyone, but I began writing letters to newspapers, protesting against homophobic news reports or highlighting instances of injustice. And initially, I was too scared to even sign my name. But then over a few months, I began to sign my name and eventually even gave my address. But I did actually live in fear of a police knock at the door.
Were you getting support from your family, or were they ignoring this?
No, they were totally hostile.
They're most of them fundamentalists?
Yeah, I'd say they're veering on the fundamentalist.
And was homosexuality still criminally penalised in Australia at this time?
In the state of Victoria, in Melbourne, where I lived, it was.
Now, you said you came out then at 17 in 1969. Were you living an active gay life, or just assuming a political label, or what?
No, by 17 and a half, I was living with a boyfriend, and we had a long-term relationship.
And how did activism feel to you at that point?
Well, you see, in the past, I've been campaigning for Aboriginal civil rights of the native indigenous peoples of Australia, against the Vietnam War, against the draft, against the death penalty. So here was an issue where I was fighting for my own personal liberation, and that was really important. Not that the other issues weren't important, but previously I'd always been fighting for other causes. And so for me, there's always been a correlation between the struggle for gay and lesbian rights and the broader struggle for social justice and human rights for everyone. To me, they're indivisible. You can't separate gay rights from other human rights. They're all, they're two sides of the same coin.
Well, in fact, I want to continue this sort of chronological life story, but let me jump ahead to demonstrate your activism on that. We have another piece of tape of you attacking a right-wing British leader, confronting him in person, Nick Griffin of the British National Party, is that what it's called? And yelling at him about not just homophobia, but a couple of other things, and bringing it all together. So if we could take a quick look.
Isn't it about time you apologise to the British people for your party's long history of anti-Semitism, homophobia, and attacks on the Muslim community? This is the BNP in action. Look at them. Look at them. Get up. Why don't you apologise for your anti-Semitism, homophobia, and attacks on the Muslim community? The British people are owed an apology, Nick. Why don't you apologise, you gutless coward? You attack the vulnerable, and you won't even face an accuser. That's what Nick Griffin and the BNP stand for. It's a party of hatred, and a party that will not tolerate anybody who questions that hatred. You saw Nick Griffin. I asked him a question. He ran away. He's a gutless coward.
Why aren't more people as brave as you to do this? I mean, we're all surrounded by bigots all the time. People end up going to ceremonies with, church leaders who are anti-gay and things, who claim to be pro-gay themselves. Why don't we see more of this to end anti-gay bigotry?
Well, I wish we would, because it's one of the major reasons why we're still, not fully equal and not first class. I think, we too often give people in power and authority a free pass. We defer to their position, when to me, it doesn't matter who you are, high or low, if you're a bigot and you oppose anyone's human rights, you need to be challenged. And if you won't listen to reason, you need to be confronted. And I'm actually very surprised I'm one of the very few people who's ever directly challenged Nick Griffin in that way. He's been allowed to get away with it.
Right. Talk about your style and how you developed it. And the press takes you very seriously. In fact, you were named one of the 1,000 most influential Londoners recently by The Guardian, was it?
Evening Standard.
Evening Standard, even, you know, not even a liberal paper particularly. So how did you develop this style and approach, and why do you think it's so effective?
Well, as I said, I took my early inspiration from the Black Civil Rights Movement here in the United States, and from the struggle for women's votes in Britain, the suffragette movement. And they pioneered a style of direct action, non-violent direct action and civil disobedience to challenge injustice. And I think that while I'm all in favour of lobbying and, you know, sitting down with, you know, someone over a cup of tea and negotiating a solution, if that's not possible, and often it isn't possible, I think in the spirit of ACT UP or Queer Nation or those kind of groups, you have to take a stand. You can't just walk away. You've got to stand up for what you believe in, and you've sometimes got to be prepared to take risks. You know, every social movement throughout history, every single one that succeeded and challenged injustice has taken risks. People have put themselves on the line, and many, of course, have paid a far, far greater personal price than I have, but, you know, I'm prepared to put myself out there, and I just wish many more people would, because if they did, we would be much further advanced down the line towards not only LGBT equality, but social equality across the board.
Right, and yes, people do die for their rights every day in this world, but you have, I mean, you've been wounded, hurt, damaged by this. I mean, you know, you've had your head bashed in a number of times. You've been shot. I think your place has been shot at as well.
Firebombed, yeah.
Those kinds of things, and it's, you know, you've paid a price for that.
Yeah, but I'd say that by comparison to the heroic democracy activists in countries like Russia, Iran, or Zimbabwe, my sacrifices and my suffering is very, very small. You know, I walk in the shadow of those heroes and heroines.
Let me take you back. I just want to know how you got from Australia to Britain and established yourself there, and what you're doing there in the first place.
Well, I'd always wanted to travel anyway. But I was due to register for national service for the call-up for Vietnam, and I had a moral and political objection to the war and to the draft for the war, so I wasn't even prepared to register. And if I had maintained that position, I would have gone to prison for 2 years. And I was just starting out this new relationship with my partner, and I really, to be honest, I didn't have the guts to go through the prison experience, so we skipped the country. And went to Britain, where the Gay Liberation Front had just been established.
You're talking about 1971?
71. And the second day in London, I saw a sticker on a lamppost by Oxford Street, which advertised the meetings of the Gay Liberation Front. And within 5 days, I was at my first meeting, and within a month, I was helping to organise some of the big, spectacular protests that GLF organised.
But describe that group. I mean, Gay Liberation
Wait a
Front.
minute. I want to know if he's an illegal refugee. How'd you straighten out your
part of the
legal?
Commonwealth.
Well, in those days, because Australia was part of the Commonwealth of Nations with connections to Britain, you know, you're allowed to work there for a number of years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I just you threw me there for a second.
Gay Liberation Front. A rather
in
colorful
London.
group. Betty Bourne, one of its most famous members. Describe the kind of group that it was and the kinds of things you did.
Well, it was very similar like here in New York. I mean, the weekly meetings, there was no hierarchy, no leaders. It was a sort of grassroots, non-hierarchical organisation, ultra-democratic. We had facilitators to run the meetings, which were chosen by the group. But sometimes you'd have 800 people at a single meeting. 800, you know, phenomenal. And there'd be a mixture of, you know, left-wing and communist and anarchist types and liberals and counterculturist hippies, you know, an amazing, you know, eclectic mix. But somehow, you know, there were some fights and were some disagreements, but overall, we managed to unite and agree around an agenda to challenge what we now call homophobia, which in those days we called sexism, because in those days sexism was both the word we used to describe discrimination and prejudice against women and against LGBT people.
Sure.
Homophobia had not yet been invented as a word.
By George Weinberg.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So these were amazing, extraordinary meetings, and right from the outset, the Gay Liberation Front was very much aligned with other liberation movements, in particular the women's liberation movement. We saw straight male machismo as the common oppressor of women and gay people, and therefore gay people and women had to stand together against this common enemy. And the fight for women's rights was another side of the coin for the fight for gay rights. And if we worked together, we would be stronger.
And so we stayed together.
Yeah, we had this famous protest at the Royal Albert Hall in London for the Miss World contest in 1971. You know, while all the glitterati and hobnobs went in there and watched the official event, we had people in who disrupted it and threw smoke bombs and whistles and whatever. But on the outside, we held an alternative Miss World parade featuring misused, mistreated, and so on, plus Miss Ulster, because at the time the war in Ireland was in full swing and she was in bloodied bandages, an emaciated Miss Bangladesh to highlight poverty and injustice against women in developing countries. It was a fantastic, spectacular, extraordinary event, which even our critics and enemies applauded us for.
Well, but that is what I think people don't understand, is how creative and how much fun and how satisfying all this work is over the years. And I think they're really missing out on something by not being part of it. And their fear is keeping them from such a gratifying experience.
Well, that's right. I mean, we were motivated by idealism and radicalism and a hope of a better world, but we also had a great deal of fun at the time. It was an amazing, extraordinary period of personal liberation for all of us. I came from a very uptight, repressed, sexually repressed family where sex per se wasn't discussed and was deemed to be shameful. And within the process of the gay liberation movement, not only was that sort of internalized sex phobia and homophobia expunged, it was a reaching out to people from all different backgrounds, all different ages. There was a real coming together of people from different ethnic backgrounds, men and women. It was just a fantastic melting pot of people who were committed to a vision of what the world could be, as opposed to what it was.
But Britain got more conservative over this period, from the 70s to the 80s, the Thatcher years. But what would you consider the major accomplishments in those times before you get to the founding of Outrage in 1990?
Well, I think the Gay Liberation Front in Britain, like probably here, was the first time ever in Britain that not only hundreds but tens of thousands of LGBT people came out and marched. The Gay Liberation Front organised the first ever gay rights march in Britain. And we weren't pleading for equality. In fact, we hardly ever mentioned the word equality. We were talking about liberation, freedom. Freedom for gay and lesbian people, freedom for black people, working class people, Irish people, people in the African colonies of Portugal and so on. We were part of a liberation movement. We wanted to transform society. We didn't want to fit in. We didn't want to assimilate. We didn't want to be part of the mainstream. We wanted to transform society for the benefit of everyone, gay and straight. So, we had this view which was more than mere equality. Who wants equality within an unjust social system? Because that means just for perpetuating injustice. In those days, straight kids had really poor sex education, almost non-existent sex education in schools. So we didn't want equality with that. We wanted good quality sex education, and we campaigned for it for gay and straight kids. And we won a lot of straight allies as a result. The early days of the Gay Liberation Movement, we made no progress whatsoever in terms of law reform, but we did make huge strides in terms of public consciousness. I'm not saying we won all the battles, we didn't, but we moved from tiny public support for LGBT rights to quite significant minority support.
And now we are making legal advances which may not be as exciting as liberation. But before we get to all that, because I do want to bring it up to that, I want to take a detour to Robert Mugabe, because that, I think, is a moment that a lot of people became aware of your work and was so sort of poignant and soul-stirring and inspiring. You performed a citizen's arrest of the president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, who is a monster, still in office. We hope teetering on his last legs, but very, very powerful. So tell us how that happened.
Well, it came about because human rights activists in Zimbabwe asked me to try and do something to highlight the human rights abuses that are happening in the country, not just on LGBT rights, but on the wider, the arrest and detention and torture opposition activists, priests, students, trade unionists, and so on. So I organised a protest outside, or several protests outside the Zimbabwe High Commission in London. They were very effective, lots of people, but didn't really make a major impact. So then I hit on the idea of using international human rights law to try and bring him to justice, and using the power of citizen's arrest that we have under British law. Any private citizen who has reasonable grounds for believing that someone has committed an offence has a right to arrest that person and hand them over to the authorities. So I was going to use the law against torture, the United Nations Convention Against Torture 1984, which means that anyone who commits, authorises, acquiesces or condones acts of torture, any public official who does any of these things anywhere in the world can be arrested and put on trial in a signatory state, and Britain is a signatory state. So,
isn't that how they eventually got Pinochet in Europe somewhere?
Well, that was how initially they got him, but of course he was, you know, eventually let go. But
yes.
it was the basis on which they got Slobodan Milosevic and Charles Taylor to The Hague.
All right,
So I focused on the use of, on the Torture Convention, or the Convention Against Torture. And it wasn't just me, it was myself and 3 outraged colleagues. We ambushed his motorcade as he was leaving the St James's Court Hotel in Victoria in London. They ran in front and forced his car to stop in the street. I ran from behind. Amazingly, the car door was open, unlocked. I opened the door, reached in, grabbed him with my right hand and held out my left hand to show I didn't have a weapon. And then said, President Mugabe, you're under arrest on charges of torture. I am now summoning the police.
Wow.
You should have seen the look on his face. His eyes popped, his jaw dropped, he shrunk back in his seat like a frightened little 10-year-old boy.
Bad.
And I thought to myself, now you know how your victims feel. I mean, we aren't going to kill you or torture you. We're going to take you to a court of law. Anyway, we summoned the police. We were arrested, and he was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods.
Oy.
On the opening day of our trial, all the charges were dropped, and there were a huge list of charges, but they're all dropped. Basically because I think the government and the judiciary didn't want us to test in a court of law that we were in fact acting lawfully to bring someone to justice under British and international human rights law.
And then you also did this again in Belgium, and that's when you got your head bashed in by his thugs.
So that was 2 years later, in 2001, in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel in Brussels. I got a tip-off that Mugabe was meeting a European Union commissioner there for lunch. So I lay in the hotel lobby, and as he came out through the lobby, I sort of walked straight into the middle of his entourage and tried to arrest him again. This time I got very, very badly beaten. They dragged me off to the side and started laying into me, but then something very funny happened. All his bodyguards piled Mugabe into the revolving door to get him out and get into his limousine. But they rushed and the revolving door got stuck. So there was Mugabe with about 5 of his henchmen stuck in this revolving door, banging on someone to help them. So the people beating me left me to go and try and release the door. Meanwhile, I ran out through the fire exit and ran into the street on the other side of the revolving door. So there was Mugabe on one side of the glass and there was me on the other side. And then I was grabbed by the Belgian secret police and slammed up against the plate glass window. And then they handed me over to Mugabe's people to beat me again.
Wow.
The Belgians handed me over to have me beaten. Then all the TV crews came around and demanded to know who these bodyguards were and what authority they were beating me. And while they were being distracted, I ran between their legs, ran out into the driveway, just as Mugabe's limousine was leaving, and ran in front of it and stopped it again. Then his bodyguards piled into me, and then I was knocked unconscious.
And have lived to tell the tale.
Just about.
And you were so involved with international human rights. I mean, look, a lot of us say, well, I can't do everything, but you seem to try to do. I mean, how do you decide what your brief is?
Well, I guess my starting point is that human rights are universal and indivisible. They apply to every person on this planet. Every LGBT person, every non-LGBT person. Everyone is entitled to human rights, and that we can't say that human rights end at the border of our country. They do not. They are universal, and that body of international humanitarian law needs to be enforced to protect everyone.
Well, let's show people the film we have.
Another piece of tape of you taking on the entire world and all human rights. As well, you should.
In Iran.
Peter Tatchell, why are you here?
We're here to support the struggle of the Iranian people for democracy and human rights. We support the women who are demanding an end to sex discrimination. We support the jailed trade unionists. We support the Sunni Muslims who are persecuted because of their faith. And we support Iran's oppressed national minorities, the Kurds, Baluchis, Arabs and Azeris. Their struggle is our struggle because human rights are universal.
Thank you.
Thank you is right.
I mean, I'm totally in awe of the people in Iran. You know, it's just amazing the courage and tenacity and determination. They've had a clerical dictatorship there for like 3 decades, and still people are fighting despite the tens of thousands of people who've been murdered and executed.
And what about our countries in terms of doing more for them? Of course, we've destabilized the whole region, basically, but, you know, although there have been signs of progress in the spring, how do we get them to do more around that?
Well, yeah, I think the West too often assumes that it's perfect and is too often adopting the finger-wagging mode, whereas for me in my politics it's about solidarity with the people in these countries who are fighting the good fight. It's about supporting them, empowering them, publicising their campaigns, showing them solidarity, giving them moral support so they know that other people around the world care and support them, and that's really important.
Which is what we did not do in Iraq. We just bombed them.
Absolutely, yeah. It was completely the wrong approach, completely the wrong approach.
Well, it's a big world, and you're taking on a lot. Do you ever feel, this is useless, I'm not making any progress, I'm a tiny drop in a big ocean, and, you know, what's the point?
Well, of course, I am a minnow, but, you know, many minnows make a very huge effect. And I think, you know, we should all recognize that it's the cumulative collective effect of us all as individuals and even quite small groups and organizations. Over time, that cumulative collective effect does bring about change.
Now, you talked about those early days with 800 people, but you've mostly worked in the last 20 years with Outrage, your group, starting in 1990. Why did you found that? How many people have been involved in that? Because it looks like most of the demonstrations are spirited, creative, but relatively small.
Yeah, I mean, the Outrage came into existence largely as a response to 2 things. First of all, a wave of queer-bashing attacks and murders, which the police were not taking seriously, and correspondingly, a huge police focus on arresting gay and bisexual men for consenting victimless behavior, which wasn't even a crime between heterosexuals. Right. So our campaign slogan was policing without prejudice, protection, not persecution. And the initial big impetus of Outrage was to force the police to change their tactics. Now, initially, we did sit down with them at New Scotland Yard and negotiate. But we very soon discovered that this was just a PR exercise. Right. It was all talk, 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 you know, right. Tea and sandwiches, but nothing else. The raids continued, the arrests continued.
We see that here, too.
So Outrage walked out. We said, we're not going to be part of this window dressing exercise. We're going to teach you that you don't mess with queers. And so we began doing things like interrupting the press conferences of the then Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Paul Condon, invading and occupying police stations that were organising police raids, photographing pretty police. One of the tactics of the police would be to get a young officer, dress him up in tight white jeans, black boots, a black leather jacket, and send him into a public toilet or park, get him to wave his willy, then anybody who responded would get arrested. So we'd surreptitiously photograph these officers and then put warning signs, staple them on trees, fly post them inside toilets or on lampposts where they were operating. It was hugely embarrassing. Then we started totaling up the costs, and we went around to all the local newspapers and say, you know, do you know this is what the police are spending taxpayers, ratepayers' money on? Don't you think it would be better if they focused on racist crimes, domestic violence, sexual assaults on women, robberies, burglaries, that kind of thing? And very quickly, we won popular support, because the average person, even if they didn't necessarily agree with homosexuality, did agree this was a misappropriation of police priorities and resources. So we won over a groundswell of grassroots opinion, and within 3 or 4 months of that campaign, the police were begging for us to come back into negotiations.
This sounds like a good idea for New York.
I love this idea.
Taking notes over here.
Instead, we have the police commissioner walking down the middle of Fifth Avenue at the head of the cops in the Pride Parade, and everybody applauding.
Just 2 days after the raid on the Eagle Bar.
Exactly.
I was appalled. I couldn't believe it. And people were clapping. People were clapping.
Oh, yeah. So they're so grateful for this. This, you know, the powers that be show up, and people are just, oh, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
It's a little pathetic, folks.
Very pathetic.
We need to have a little bit more self-respect.
I'll just finish off this story. That campaign, eventually, within 1 year, the police agreed to 3/4 of our demands for non-homophobic policing policy within 1 year, which initially they said they'd never do. They agreed. And one of the reasons they agreed is we came to them with practical proposals. We said, this is the way you're doing it. This is the way you could do it. So they were actually, some of the officers were actually quite impressed that we came with pragmatic solutions. Radical solutions, but achievable ones.
Right.
Within 3 years, the number of gay and bisexual men convicted for consenting behaviour fell by 2/3. The biggest, fastest fall ever recorded. So our conclusion is, where lobbying had failed, direct action worked.
So they stopped doing the entrapment?
Yes. Yep.
Wow, that would be nice. And you also were very involved with ACT UP in London, and we were here, and a lot of this sounds a lot like ACT UP. So what was your experience of ACT UP?
I was actually involved in setting up a precursor organisation. Before ACT UP was set up, just before ACT UP was set up here, I set up an organisation called the UK AIDS Vigil Organisation, which was to campaign specifically for the human and civil rights of people living with HIV and AIDS. And I think that's the first such organisation anywhere in the world.
Well, of course, Bill Ballman, our associate producer here, was involved in something called the Lavender Hill Mob preceding ACT UP, would kind of help lead to that.
Anyway, we organised a big AIDS and human rights conference, I think the first in the world, to coincide with the World Health Ministers Summit in London in 1988. We had a huge candlelit march the night before and an alternative conference right next to the main Health Ministers Conference Centre. And as a result, even though human rights and discrimination was not on the agenda, after I barged into the main conference, misusing my journalistic pass, and berated the British Health Minister, they did issue a very strong positive statement condemning discrimination and urging education rather than repression. So it really had a big, big impact. And really, then ACT UP was formed around that time, or maybe just before, just after, and then we all moved in and became part of the London chapter of ACT UP.
Okay. Now, you've adopted different tactics at different times, and one of them in recent years has been running for office, which sounds like quite a switch from everything you've described so far. What led you to that, and what was that experience like, and how do you feel about organized politics?
I touch it or reach out to it with a great deal of skepticism and with a very long spoon. The first time I ran for public office was in 1983, when I ran as a left-wing Labour candidate in the area where I live, of southeast London, in Bermondsey. And I was selected as a candidate. I never actually initially intended or set out to be a candidate, but I was a local party organiser and had succeeded in rebuilding the local party. It was defunct and dead. It was like one of these old sort of Tammany Hall Democratic strongholds, you know. A shell of a party run by a... Well, it was a shell of a...
like the Democratic Party now.
It was a shell of a party run by a handful of ruling families. When I first applied to join, they said, "I'm sorry, you can't join. We're full." Anyway, and they had no community, no links to the local community. They were as right-wing as hell. They were loathed by local people. The Labour support was going down. Anyway, I redoubled the party membership, connected with tenants associations, community groups, trade unions, rebuilt the whole thing. And what happened was the existing Labour MP decided to retire, so they needed to find someone. And initially, I wasn't even going to stand, but there was a grassroots, groundswell opinion to get me to stand, and surprisingly, I was selected.
And you ought to have been elected. It's a Labour district.
I should have been elected, yes, but there was the most vicious anti-gay and anti-left campaign, demonising me. I had 4 fascist candidates against me, 4 openly fascist candidates, plus an alternative real Labour candidate, which was backed by half of the, well, unofficially backed by many people in the Labour Party who didn't like my left-wing politics. And then on top of that, I had virtually the whole of Fleet Street, the newspaper, the tabloid, in particular the tabloids, but even some of the quality press against me. This is a time when Labour was really split between left and right, and I became to be a symbol of the left-wing struggle for democracy and socialism within the Labour Party. Well, so they just pardoned to me, and I was just trashed for. In the 15 months before the election, almost every single day, they ran attacking stories, including fake stories. Like they made up a story that I went to the Gay Olympics in San Francisco. I didn't go. I wish I had now, but you know, it's to play to homophobia and to stir up hatred and prejudice against me.
It would have been fun to have you asking questions at Prime Minister's Question Time of Margaret Thatcher at the time.
It would have.
But and your opponent eventually apologized to you, didn't he?
He did. Yes. The person who won was a Liberal, now a Liberal Democrat MP, Simon Hughes, in fact the president of the party, and I won't say that he was involved, but certainly his party waged a viciously anti-gay campaign, you know, going around on the doorstep reminding everyone that I was gay, saying I supported gay rights, trying to plant the seeds of homophobia.
Danny Drum out in Queens just a couple of years ago when he was running, they littered the housing projects with literature about him being gay and do you want this?
And our current governor, who's now the big hero, ran an anti-gay campaign for his father against a closeted gay
allegedly
opponent.
Allegedly.
We can talk about that.
But things have changed for LGBT people in British politics over the years. You now have civil partnerships. You have out members of the ruling administration and throughout Parliament. Does that feel like an advance? Are things getting better, or is this just assimilation, or are they conservative creeps? What's going on?
Well, in terms of formal legal equality, we have moved mountains. Up until the mid to late 1990s, Britain had more homophobic laws than any other country on earth. Even than like Iran or the former Soviet Union. You know, we had more homophobic laws.
Death penalty?
We didn't have the death penalty, but more in numbers of anti-gay laws.
Oh, but Britain is famous for numbers of laws.
And had spread those, you know, all the anti-gay laws in India and elsewhere were brought by Britain, not by the indigenous people.
Absolutely, absolutely. But now we're in a situation within the space of 1 decade, or less than 1 decade, all of those anti-gay laws, bar one, have been repealed. The only one that remains is the ban on same-sex civil marriage. But every single other one has gone. So we have absolute equality in legal terms, and correspondingly there's been a huge shift in public opinion. But in a way, the direct action tactics of outrage in the 1990s laid the basis of that 2 decades ago. You know, our constant, you know, we were doing direct actions every week or other week and getting huge publicity, and the purpose of that publicity was to conscientize people about the degree of discrimination and to make people aware of just how second-class we were. So even in advance of the political changes, public opinion was in favour of equalising the age of consent, ending the ban on gays and lesbians in the military and so on. So that effective protest was very important in helping to win hearts and minds.
And we're going to get to your Equal Love campaign, and of course, we're going to talk about a tougher opponent that you faced, the Pope, in Britain. He made a visit to Britain, and you were one of the chief organizers of the demonstration there, yes?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
And,
well, let's, as long as we're on to the Pope, let's take a look at a little of the footage of you and your opinion of the Pope.
Unlike the Pope, we are Democrats. We defend his right to come to Britain and express his point of view. But we also assert our right to protest against his often harsh, intolerant teachings. Unlike the Pope, we practice tolerance. We did not witch hunt liberation theologians in South America. The Vatican did. Since he's been in Britain, the Pope has made another of his half-baked apologies. He always apologizes for the failings of others in the Church, but never for his own failings.
Well, our mutual friend, Bernard Lynch, a Roman Catholic priest, was in that demonstration at somewhat greater risk in his Roman collar, also protesting the Pope as well.
Yeah, it brought together a fantastic coalition of Catholics and non-Catholics, humanists, secularists, women's rights campaigners, gay rights campaigners, people protesting for the right to women's choice of abortion, for Planned Parenthood, contraception, and so on.
And the Pope has come out for condoms for male prostitutes since then. That's about it.
Well,
that's about all he's changed on.
If you read that statement, I mean, essentially what he is saying is that he is condoning the use of condoms. He's saying that in certain exceptional circumstances, condoms may be the lesser of two evils. Now, that's not the kind of wording or language or policy that I would write, but that is movement from a Pope who previously has always refused to move. And we did attack him mercilessly during his visit and in the run-up to it over the condom issue. And I actually did a Channel 4 documentary which highlighted the effect that these policies have in developing countries. I went to the Philippines and spoke to poor families in the Philippines, and so many of the women said to me, well, look, we want to use contraception, but the Pope says we can't. We said, the priest says we'll go to hell. The priest says contraception will make us ill and kill us. I mean, it's shocking, shocking stuff.
It is shocking, because when I was a young Catholic and a member of Dignity, I don't remember anybody who was waiting for the Pope's permission to go to bed with another guy, including the priests.
Well, but it's true. It's a very mixed experience around the world. But it's interesting how much rage there is at the Pope and the Vatican in general over the sexual molestation. That has just brought people out in such anger in ways that I think none of us who've been anti the Vatican for years would have expected.
Well, absolutely, and we must always remember that when he was a cardinal in 2001, Benedict was in charge of dealing with this issue of child sex abuse. He sent a letter to every Catholic bishop in the world ordering them to report all child sex abuse cases to him in Rome and ordering them to maintain papal secrecy. In other words, not to go to the civil authorities.
Right.
So the idea that he didn't know what was going on way back in 2001, 2002, that's nonsense.
And when he was the Archbishop in Munich, I guess it was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He also did engaged in cover-ups. But again, the question is, for Catholics out there, is why do you tolerate such leadership in your church?
Well, I think a lot of people don't. You know, the We Are the Church movement is very big in Europe, and I think here it's growing. Many Catholics are disenchanted with the Pope and the Vatican and see his teachings as being completely anathema to the Christian gospel of love and compassion.
Well, I'd love to think there was a big revolution here, but I think what happens here is people ignore the teachings and those kinds of rules, but they still want to venerate the trappings of the
hierarchy.
Yeah, and the patriarchy, and the we want to have someone who we can look to as being
daddy,
in charge.
as you were saying.
Big daddy, whether it's him or politicians or whatever. So he doesn't get undermined in the ways he should. People ignore him, but it doesn't then spread to the people in the Philippines who are still paying attention to that.
Well, when I went to Germany to make the Channel 4 documentary, we went to the homeland of German Catholicism in the Munich area, and you know, where the papal support has traditionally been strongest, and we found widespread disaffection. We were told about, you know, many people leaving the church and churches being half empty where they've previously been filled. And I think, you know, I'm surprised that more people haven't defected, but quite clearly some people, their faith is very important. And I just feel really pained that the many good Catholics who do stand for universal human rights, the rights of women and gay people, that they are not being affirmed, they're not being given a space. And when you think this Pope, the war he waged against liberation theologians, particularly in South America, it's absolutely shocking.
It is.
You know, not only striking against people who stood, Catholics who stood for social justice, but clearly an act of censorship and repression against people who are part of his church.
So can we expect an attempted citizen's arrest of the Pope somewhere?
Well, I did think of that when he came to Britain, but the legal grounds are quite difficult. I only attempt these things when there's really strong legal grounds.
And they let Mugabe in for the beatification of John Paul into the Vatican.
Yeah.
He got to go through Italian airspace.
Yeah, what message is the Vatican sending when it allows that?
No, I don't know.
Well, your big campaign now is something called Equal Love. Look, you've had civil partnerships in Britain which supposedly give almost all the rights of marriage to same-sex couples since
2005, they came into effect.
Right, and but you're saying this is not equal, and how's the campaign going? What are you fighting for?
Under British law, we've got two discriminations. Gay couples are banned from having a civil marriage, and heterosexual couples are banned from having a civil partnership. So in my view, two wrongs don't make a right. You know, every couple should have a free and equal choice to have a civil marriage or a civil partnership, or to remain single, or just live together, you know. This campaign is intended to challenge both those twin discriminations, to assert the right of same-sex couples to have a civil marriage and heterosexual couples to have a civil partnership. We, in February this year, filed an application in the European Court of Human Rights. There were 4 gay couples and 4 straight couples seeking to overturn the twin bans. And we're fairly confident that the European Court will eventually, and it usually takes 3 years or so, will eventually rule in our favour, because there is very little difference. They are essentially the same, to which our response is, why have 2 separate systems? Or why be mutually exclusive if they're both so similar? Some people say, well, what are you fussing about? You know, it's just a name. Well, if it's just a name, open up the systems to everyone.
Which is essentially the argument we're making in the Prop 8 case, where California has full domestic partnerships but doesn't let them use the word marriage.
The argument all over in this country about civil unions versus marriage, it just is nonsensical.
And
I mean, we make the strong argument that no one would tolerate it if the government said to black couples, you're banned from marriage, but we'll give you a separate civil partnership instead. Right. People would say that would be racism. It's apartheid. It's like South Africa. One law for black people, a different law for white people.
Well, it reveals the extent to which we are still held in contempt or...
Absolutely. I'm not a great fan of marriage. I share the feminist critique of all the patriarchy and sexism of that institution. I wouldn't want to get married, but I resent absolutely the right that the law says I can't get married. And even though I wouldn't want to get married, I say that other couples who want to make their choice should be free to do so. And
you took advantage of an event this spring in a much gentler approach than we've seen you in some of these other tapes. The royal wedding of William and Kate. You were quite charming and lovely about this, and I thought, wow, what's happened to Peter Tatchell? But let's take a look at that.
That way?
I want to thank you all for coming today. We're here to send our best wishes to William and Kate. We wish them a happy wedding day and a happy married life together. Kate and William are lucky. They can get married. Gay couples can't. That's not fair. In a democratic society, marriage should be open to everyone. We hope that within the confines of royal protocol, somehow Kate and William will find a way to express their support for marriage equality, so that same-sex couples can have the same right as they have to get married if they wish.
Now,
did they send a signal?
Well, I was going to say, I don't go to sex.
That was a text from William.
I don't go to sex discordant weddings. I boycott them. But I watched that one, and I didn't see the sign.
Well, I think, as you say, this was a more gentle approach, but
yes.
But very effective.
Yeah.
Because basically we're just saying a very simple message. We wish the couple well. I'm not a royalist. I'm a Republican, but I'm not.
Small. Explain that, please, for our viewers.
Yes.
Small R Republican. I am too.
Not
what does
U.S.
it mean?
Republican.
What does it mean?
It means I don't support the monarchy. I think we should have an elected head of state.
A republic.
Yeah, a republic where the head of state is accountable to the people, and where it's open to anyone based on merit and the people's choice.
As opposed to that German family running your country now.
Absolutely.
But do you have any sense from them that the royal family as a whole, or any of them, that they can be any help on any of this?
Well, I think that was a bit of a long shot, but to be perfectly honest. But the important thing is, it struck the right chord, and it was a carefully crafted, well-balanced action, which won a lot of public support. I mean, after this was, we got people to sign the card. We found all the tourists outside Buckingham Palace, where that protest was. They were all rushing to sign, saying, "Yes, of course, gay couples should have the right to get married. Good on you." And we were really surprised. We were surprised at the level of public support. And in fact, in our opinion polls in Britain, even before this campaign began, 61% of the British people were saying that gay couples should be able to have a civil marriage in a register office. So the public is on our side. It's the politicians who are holding us back.
And an even tougher opponent than the Pope is football in your country. There's a lot of anti-gay bigotry expressed at football matches, soccer we would call it here. You're also leading a campaign around that. And what does that consist of? I actually heard somebody ask the Prime Minister during question time this week about it, and he said he was in favor of it. But what does it consist of, and how is it going to work? Because you get thousands of people in the stands shouting terrible things.
Yeah, I'd say that football is one of the last great bastions of homophobia. And the demographic between football fans and anti-gay intolerance in the wider society, it's a big crossover, very similar. So we think that if we can challenge homophobia in football, we not only boot homophobia out of the game, but we'll also get to that section of the population that tends to be most homophobic, mostly younger, straight young men. And we're going to try and do that by producing a video with an MTV-style video, very cool, very sophisticated, very hip, with a good music track, maybe get some big-name footballers to do endorsements. And we think that will not only have an impact in Britain, but we think around the world, because this video, I think, will make an impact all across borders, because homophobia in football is a major problem in many, many countries.
Well, you did have a rugby player come out. Gareth Thomas is his name?
That's correct, yeah.
And very successfully. But what about in football?
No, not a single player has come out since Justin Fashanu in 1990, and then he was hounded and eventually ended up committing suicide. It was a slightly complicated story. There's a bit more to it than that, but he did get a lot of anti-gay abuse. But he's the only footballer, the only professional top league footballer who's ever come out. And we know proportionately there must be 50 or 60 top flight players in the Premier League who are gay or bisexual. Not one of them is open.
Well, you've talked about advances politically and in public opinion, and here in the United States, public opinion is moving in this direction too, but sounds like we're a little behind. But there are these really virulent pockets of anger and fear and violence. We still tell stories every week from around the world, including Britain, about attacks on gay people. Do you have any sense of how to attack that core, that sort of irreducible hatred and fear?
Well, I think the campaigning against homophobia in football is one aspect, but also, of course, proper education, effective education in schools is very important.
Where does Britain stand with that?
Well, we have, in about half our schools, we have explicit anti-homophobia bullying campaigns, about half. In the others, it's sort of like, it's not explicit, it's a generalized bullying campaign, but doesn't really properly address issues of homophobia or transphobia. I think the other big issue is, of course, the media's representation of LGBT people has improved a lot in Britain in recent years, and that is helping to also influence public consciousness in a positive direction. But we have organised religion, football, business to some extent. Business, there are very few in Britain. There are very, very few out people in top-flight business, and the City of London is notorious for its, aggressive, competitive, macho environment, and quite a few gay people and lesbian people in the City of London have been forced out or subjected to abuse. And that's an area where we need to move. So there's a lot of unfinished business.
Speaking of which, so you've talked about equal love and the football thing, but sort of what are your top priorities as you return to your country?
Well, we also, like here in the United States, we have a blanket lifetime ban on gay and bisexual men donating blood. In Britain, any man who's ever had sex with another man, even just once, even with a condom, even 50 years ago, is banned for life from donating blood.
Oh, here it's only since 1977.
All right, okay. Okay, only since 1977, okay. That policy may be about to change, but it's only because we've had a very, very high-profile campaign for the last 10 years to force the blood authorities to reassess their policies, because that blanket exclusion is not medically or scientifically based.
And you haven't visited the United States since 1997. You've already given one of your impressions at the way we applaud people like our police commissioner in the parade, but what do you see here? Be honest, we can take it.
Yeah.
Come on,
Please,
let us have it.
Please.
Oh, I'm glad to be back, and it was fantastic to be in the New York Pride Parade on Sunday, and I marched with the Bradley Manning contingent to support the man who blew the whistle on war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also supported the group that was protesting against the Israeli occupation and in solidarity with queer people in Palestine. It's great to see people in the United States raising those issues, sometimes uncomfortable issues that a lot of people don't necessarily support, but they're issues of principle. And, I wish everyone here in the United States, that the battle continues and that you will win.
Do you have any plans for the London Olympics?
Well, we were trying to get an LGBT input into the Cultural Olympiad, which runs in parallel. But we've had very little success.
You mean we're not running it?
They had a gay house at the Vancouver Olympics. Surely you'll have at least that.
No, we were told no, it wasn't part of their agenda.
Wow.
But I've got to say, this isn't just about LGBT people. It's about downplaying women, black and ethnic minority people, disabled people, right across the board. The promises of a multicultural Olympics that London made when it won the bid are not being fulfilled.
And is that because the government has become more conservative?
Partly because the government's more conservative, partly because the money is tighter. The budget is many times over what it was originally. But even so, a lot of these things they could do for very little cash.
We're down to our last minute. You can be contacted through your website, petertatchell.com, which we've been running.
.net.
Oh, I'm sorry.
petertatchell.net.
Sorry, peter.tatchell.net. Correct that. Sorry.
And in our last 30 seconds, you're in your 50s. Do you see retiring or doing this forever?
No. I'm coming up to 60, and I've got another 30 years in me, I reckon.
Okay.
And there's a lot of unfinished business. And, to me, it's been one of the great privileges of my life to work with so many extraordinary human rights activists in Europe, United States, and in developing countries around the world. Our common struggle is a struggle for freedom, and we will win.
And it's been our great privilege to have you here for this hour and to introduce you more personally to our Gay USA viewers. Thank you for what you do, and thank you all for watching, and we will see you next week.
And on petertatchell.net.
To find out more about this show and all of our programming, visit our website, www.mnn.org.